So for a while, whenever my partner did something weird like does a silly dance or something, he'll say, "That's why I was single for so long." I found it funny for a few reasons, mainly because he was only single for 2 months before he met me, while I was single for a solid 5 years. He's had his fair share of serious relationships, while I've never had a relationship last more than a month. He always counters with, "Well, you were single by choice," which got me thinking about how typically my guy friends who constantly complain about being single or lonely, while my femme/non-gender conforming friends are often perfectly happy on their own. Of course, it's not a hard rule. I have masc friends who love being single and femme friends who really want a partner. But still, there's a noticeable gender difference that's interesting enough to rant about. It makes me wonder if it's tied into how men and women are taught to view relationships first. Women are constantly encouraged to view on their independence, their self-discovery journey, and personal goals, and the message is that you're whole on your own regardless of relationship status, especially since liberal feminism hit the mainstream. There's no rush to get into a happily ever after because honestly, those don't exist. But for men, it's almost the opposite. They're given this subtle push towards relationships as a sign of stability and success with little emphasis on finding fulfillment alone. Just look at the way that people respond to single men versus single women. For women, comments like, "She's taking her time for herself," or "She's waiting for the right person." But for men, especially as they get older, it turns into, "Are you a bad person because women don't want to date you?" Or "Are you secretly gay?" Even if they are single by choice. These questions still exist for women obviously, but they're still often toned down with the assumption that single women might just be choosing to wait for the right partner, especially when talking to someone whose views are more progressive. But then with men, all of a sudden they go back on traditional values where your life is going to be filled with misery without a woman's touch. The fact that studies show the happiest men are married while the happiest women are single is pretty telling about how men and women experience relationships differently. Traditional marriage is a stabilizing factor for men. It provides companionship, emotional support, and a sense of purpose, which may be why men feel happier and more fulfilled in a committed relationship. It's almost like marriage completes the support network they might lack otherwise, allowing them to rely on their partner in ways that women might not feel they need. Women, on the other hand, seem to gain happiness from independence and self-fulfillment because of how much a traditional marriage doesn't really hold positives for women. Many women report feeling less burden and more control of their lives when they're single because they're not responsible for someone else's emotional needs or day-to-day well-being. This difference also says a lot about societal expectations. For men, there's often a subconscious expectation that they'll be settled for life once they're married, with a partner who supports them. But women, who are generally socialized to be more nurturing, are often expected to take on a caregiving roles even within a marriage without children. In a traditional role in marriage, where all you have to do is go to work and come back, seems like a pretty good deal when your wife is doing everything. So as a wife, where again, traditionally, you become an unpaid chef, maid, nanny, and sometimes even a bookkeeper for your husband. I can imagine it can get pretty tiring after a couple decades. This might be why single women report higher levels of satisfaction, since they're free to focus on themselves without the societal pressures of being the perfect partner or meeting someone else's impossible standards constantly. So many of my male friends seem to view relationships as what they need to feel whole or successful. One friend of mine who is convinced that his mental health, social life, and even his school performance would magically improve if he just had a girlfriend. It's a pretty dangerous mindset since it turns relationships into a crutch for self-worth instead of learning to be secure on your own. When things don't magically improve with a new relationship, they feel even worse, like they failed. I told my friend that he should focus on fixing his own life without a partner rather than relying on a girlfriend to do it. But he brushed it off saying, "I've worked on myself enough, I just need to find the right person." He became more frustrated and discouraged every time a talking stage failed because he couldn't seem to find someone, convinced that a partner was the missing piece that would solve everything. This same mindset often leads people to rush into relationships or settle for anyone who just comes along, just to avoid being single. When someone thinks a partner will solve everything, they're more likely to ignore red flags, compromise values, or tolerate toxic behavior just to keep the relationship. I've seen friends bounce from one short-term relationship to another desperate for validation, only to end up in situations that take an even bigger toll on their mental health. Focusing on a relationship to feel whole isn't sustainable. It creates an emotional dependency where their self-worth hangs on the relationship status. If that relationship ends, they're left with nothing stable to fall back on. Instead of building resilience and working through challenges on their own, they just start to rely on partners to make them feel good. It's a mindset that doesn't just harm their well-being, but it puts unhealthy pressures on partners to complete them, which isn't a fair or healthy expectation for anyone. There's something strange about how men seem to be more desirable the moment they're in a relationship. It's almost like specifically straight women see a partnered man as more valuable, like he's proven himself somehow just by having a girlfriend or wife, whereas a single guy is seen as unproven, again, even if he's single by choice. Like how an alpha male are ripped on because even though they're single by choice, they're still blamed to be the reason to not have a girlfriend despite how much they say, "I don't have a girlfriend simply because I don't want one. If I wanted one, I could get one by tomorrow." You know, like me whenever I want a burger. because people are burgers. It seems like a relationship for men signals to others that they're reliable, attractive, or at least a good enough person to hold down a serious relationship. It's as if their relationship validates their qualities and shows that they're not only dateable, but also desirable. You know that joke that goes like, a woman is more likely to date a man who lives with his wife rather than a man who lives with his mom. I know it's a joke, but the underlying idea is that living with his wife, while it might seem morally questionable, signals that he's established, mature, and capable of holding down a serious relationship. A guy living with his mom, on the other hand, is often unfairly stereotyped as being immature or too dependent. This idea plays off the stereotype that men should be providers, or at the very least independent, and living with his mom seems to counter that image. Even though in this economy, I think it'd make more sense for people to still live with their parents. It's a strange cultural quirk that shows just how much we equate a man's worth with his relationship status and living situation. There's a weird bias in valuing him more for being taken, even in potentially messy ways, rather than being supportive if he's working his way up independently. Interestingly, this dynamic doesn't work the same for women. Single women aren't automatically viewed as more desirable or upgraded as soon as they get into a relationship. In fact, single women often carry a certain intrigue and independence that can be attractive to others, while a woman in a relationship might not be seen as having those same desirable qualities, especially now where there's a trend for progressive women to be encouraged to set high, sometimes unreachable, standards. And don't get me wrong, having high standards is great, as long as you can meet them yourself. Because to me, expecting a partner to provide things you can't offer yourself feels unrealistic and sets the bar in ways that can be difficult for anyone to reach. There's a clear difference in how society views high standards for women versus men. When a man is picky or has specific expectations, especially when those expectations are more leaned on looks, he's often labeled as demanding or shallow. But if a woman has similar standards, she's praised for knowing her worth and having high expectations, which again is great. Women should have high standards, but why aren't men given that same space? Men are expected to be grateful for any relationship, even if it's not the right one for them. Women, on the other hand, are encouraged to keep searching until they find the right one who meets all their criteria. This leads to that whole "you're lucky she even wants to be with you" mentality, as if men don't deserve to have their own standards or pursue a partner who truly fits them. This double standard puts a lot of pressure on men to settle, while women are pushed to hold out for more. And yes, men notice this discrepancy. It makes things difficult for women too. On one hand, women are rightfully told by other women to keep their standards high, but on the other hand, the same men complaining about those standards are often the ones pressuring women to be easier or less difficult. You know that whole "men ask for so little" line, which honestly just feels like a backhanded way of saying men just want women to meet traditional beauty standards and play into old school gender roles. Instead of tearing down women for having high standards, why don't men just raise theirs? Focus on finding a partner who's truly compatible with your values and personality, not just tear down women who you don't fit their criteria. When men actually want things like emotional support, shared interests, and genuine connection, they often feel like they're not allowed to ask for that. Society has drilled this idea into their heads that they should be happy with anyone who looks good on their arm. But there's more to a fulfilling relationship than just that. There's an odd double standard in how friends and coworkers give relationship advice to men versus women. It's almost as if people assume women need protecting from their relationships, whereas men are usually left alone to figure it out. I don't know if it's just my own personal experience, but even if the woman is at fault, the common response seems to be, "I hope she breaks up with you." It's as if the assumption is that women's relationships are fragile and need constant reevaluation, while men's relationships are either taken at face value or left unexamined. This leads to a lot of unbalanced feedback, with women being told to reevaluate and watch out for red flags, while men are simply left to go with the flow and just wait for things to happen, because they're just a man, obviously incapable of deduction and deep thoughts. It's well-meaning behavior for women at times, but it can also come off as condescending and overly involved, especially when the advice feels more like meddling than genuine support to me. I remember working in the same environment as my partner, and some of my female coworkers would ask how I got him, as if being with him was some big accomplishment. My honest answer was that I was perfectly happy being single. Actually, I even preferred it because I absolutely despised men when I met him. But he just happened to treat me like a normal human being instead of seeing me for my gender. But anytime he and I would have a disagreement and things felt awkward at work, these same coworkers would push me to break up with him, even though they never seemed to give him that same advice. I'm not sure if their intentions were entirely malicious, but it was hard to not notice the mixed signals, especially since one of these coworkers constantly made sexual jokes towards him, to the point where he had to ask me to confront her about it because she didn't take him seriously when he'd tell her to stop. It left me wondering if their advice was more about wanting him available than actually caring about my happiness. This can also lead to a lot of unwanted behaviors and uncomfortable situations. That saying "I'm no better than a man" doesn't justify crossing boundaries. If someone wants to act better than what they criticize, they need to be accountable for their own behavior regardless of gender. Just because someone is a woman doesn't mean they get a pass to sexually assault someone. And it's disappointing to see so many feminist women bring out questionable behaviors that wouldn't fly if the roles were reversed. Because I've unfortunately noticed that some women who often joke about being just as bad as men use it as an excuse to lose self-control or act inappropriately towards men, whether they're in a relationship or not. Unless you're a man, of course. Because there's a surprisingly number of guys who don't seem to understand that SA is a serious violation, regardless of who it's coming from. You'll hear things like, "Oh, I wish a woman would do that to me," as if it's flattering or something. But here's the issue, those guys are imagining it with consent, which completely misses the point. The reason that SA is traumatic isn't because of the people involved, it's because it takes away a person's choice, their safety, and their boundaries. It's a violation of autonomy, and no one should be okay with that happening to anyone. This also seems to be tied in how some men view relationships, consent, and respect. Just look at how angry some guys get about being friend-zoned. I'd see that same friend who desperately wanted a girlfriend get so upset about ending up in the friend zone, saying that no one would ever want him romantically. He didn't ever seem to get mad at the women specifically, just at the fact that things weren't working out, but for him, being in the friend zone was like losing out on something he felt like he deserved. It was as if a friendship was this second place prize, somehow less valuable than a romantic relationship. I never understood why it has to be like that. Why does friendship have to be seen as failure? For him and a lot of guys, being friend zoned wasn't just a romantic rejection, it felt like a hit to their worth, and suddenly friendship became something disappointing rather than meaningful. This might explain why a lot of men struggle with handling rejection. It's interesting because in my experience, women don't take rejection nearly as personal. Most women I know are fine with friendships and don't see them as failures if there's no romantic interest. But some men treat the friend zone as if it's the worst thing ever. As if the only way to connect with a woman is through romance. I think part of this might come from how men are conditioned to link their value to romantic success. Being friend zoned feels like a reminder that they've failed to be desirable. And with all these alpha male influencers pushing the idea that a man's worth is tied to how many women want him, it's easy to see why. These types preach that if you're not in a relationship or aren't being chased by women somehow, you're somehow losing. Some go as far to say if a woman isn't interested, it's somehow the guy's fault, and he should do everything he can to make her regret it. This is not only unhealthy, but also disrespectful. It treats women's disinterest as a challenge to be overcome rather than a boundary to be respected. These influences encourage men to manipulate, act superior, or play games to make her change her mind or feel regret, pushing guys to ignore her feelings entirely. They end up trying everything from flaunting status to petty mind games, hoping she'll see what she's missing. So apparently it isn't all about building self-worth or growth anymore, it's just about resentment and power over someone else's choices. The alpha male mindset also puts pressure on men to see every woman as a conquest, which turns every possible friendship into shallow pursuit. If men believe they're only women when they're in a romantic relationship, then any rejection or friend zoning feels like an attack on their masculinity. It keeps them from forming meaningful, platonic relationships just because they're viewing women as markers of success rather than real people they could connect with. And this cycle just reinforces insecurity, making them dependent on external validation. So instead of finding confidence in who they are, these guys get stuck in chasing approval from women, confident that if they just try harder, she'll come crawling back. Instead of obsessing over how to win a woman's attention or feel like you're missing out because you're single, focus on building a life that feels good on your own terms. Try hobbies you're genuinely interested in. Make friends with people who appreciate you for who you are and not just your gender. And work on building up the parts of yourself that actually make you feel fulfilled. Whether that be money, status, or body goals, work on these things for yourself, not for anyone else's approval. The truth is, no matter what you achieve, you won't always get the girl, so it's pointless to make that the focus. Confidence and self-assurance come from knowing that you don't need a relationship to feel whole. And the irony is, that's exactly what makes you attractive anyway. And guess what? When you're genuinely happy being single, you're not only less likely to feel lonely, you're more likely to attract healthy, meaningful relationships when the time is right. The right connections should add to your life, not fix it. And being single is the best time to build that foundation for yourself. The advice often given to women about self-worth and independence, it applies to men too. If you're desperate for connection, that neediness can drive people away in both romantic and platonic relationships. The goal should be finding peace and fulfillment within yourself first, so when someone does come along, they're drawn to the real you. Alright, that's it. Laters.